Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our latest installment of Alumni College, a part of the University of Illinois Alumni Association Speaker Series. My name is Dave Bambry, and I have the honor of serving as Vice President of Alumni and Student Engagement at the Alumni Association. And we are just very excited to have you all with us tonight. We're also very excited to be joined by another amazing faculty member here this evening. But before I jump into the session, I did just want to let everyone know that we have left time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. So please feel free to submit questions through the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen at any point during the program. I also want to again thank you all for being here and would encourage you to keep an eye on your email for future speaker series events or to visit UIAA.org to learn more about the many great engagement opportunities that the Alumni Association has available. With that, I want to introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Adrian Burgos Jr. is a historian that specializes in U.S. Latino history, sports history, urban history, and African American history. His teaching, publications, and public engagement have focused on the migration and immigration experience of Latinos within the United States as it illuminates processes of identity formation, urbanization, and labor. In particular, he examines the manner in which Latinos have become part of U.S. society while simultaneously engaging in transnational practices wherein many strove to retain their cultural identities. His first book, Playing America's Game, Baseball, Latinos, and the Color Line, analyzes the incorporation of players from the Spanish-speaking Americas into U.S. professional baseball to eliminate the working of baseball's color line. His second book, Cuban Star, How One Negro League Owner Changed the Face of Baseball, takes his interest in race and baseball integration further as it explores what it means to be Black and brown in the United States through Alejandro Pompez's life story, an Afro-Cuban American who went from a Negro League team owner and Harlem numbers king to a Major League Baseball scout that opened the Dominican talent pipeline. His scholarship on Latinos in baseball has also led to his collaborating as an academic advisor on museum exhibits such as the National Baseball Hall of Fame's Viva Baseball and documentaries such as Roberto Clemente and The 10th Inning. The courses he teaches at Illinois include Caribbean Latino migrations, Latinos in cities, urban history, and sport and society, along with more specialized theme courses such as integration stories, A Tale of Two Integrations, and race in the city. With that, and without further delay, I want to turn it over to Dr. Adrian Burgos Jr. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the introduction, David. And also thanks to the U of I Alumni Association and Casey Arnold. We are finally doing this. Casey and I have been in communication for a couple of years so that we can kick off baseball season with an academic talk to the Alumni Association. And here we are in 2021, and we're able to do it. So I am so pleased that we're able to finally share my work. So the title of the talk is Afro-Latinos in Baseball, Hidden in Plain Sight. This talk is really building on the research I've done over the last 20 years, but really driven by a couple of incidents in baseball that have arisen over the last year and a half or so. And in particular, I wanted to refocus the attention of some to the story of Latinos in baseball, but more particularly to the story of Afro-Latinos in baseball. And so on this cover slide, you see the image of 4 different Afro-Latinos. All the way to my left, your right on the screen is an image of 2 players from the Negro Leagues. One with the left-handed glove is Clifland Clark. The other is, well, we got to know him in Chicago as Minnie Minoso. Minoso being an Afro-Cuban player. At center, someone who most people who are baseball fans will recognize, and that is Roberto Clemente. Then there's also, formerly of Cleveland, now of the New York Mets, Francisco Lindor. And I want to open with 2 vignettes for us to kind of set the ground for the issues that I'm exploring in this talk and exploring in a project I'm working on by this title about Latinos hidden in plain sight. In February 2021, Seattle Mariners team president, now former team president and CEO, Kevin Mather, resigned after his speech to the Rotary Club in Bellevue, Washington became public. Leaked clips from the recorded Zoom revealed Mather's view about baseball operation matters, but also about diversity. Among the things that Mather shared with the crowd there at the Rotary Club was about the amount of money that he was forced to spend on mandated translators for the team's players and staff. He also took time to describe the Mariners' prospect, outfielder Julio Rodriguez, as having, quote, a personality bigger than all of you combined, who was also loud, and that, quote, his English is not tremendous, close quote. The description of Rodriguez is particularly useful for our purposes here tonight. Here we have a 20-year-old Dominican who was signed as a 16-year-old, who learned English while becoming a professional major league player, who's gregarious, and who has even hosted a show on the Seattle Mariners YouTube channel in English. And yet, the team president opted, in talking to this group of business executives in Bellevue, Washington, to fall back on familiar tropes about Latinos, about having loud personalities, that being, the contrast to a nice, quiet demeanor, the kind of Latino that major league execs, perhaps like Mather, prefer. You also have in Julio Rodriguez an Afro-Latino who's being criticized for not learning English well enough to communicate. Yet, as I mentioned, he learned English well enough to actually host the entire show on YouTube for the Seattle Mariners. And the other part is how Julio Rodriguez was also criticized for his loud personality. Combined, his accent, his personality, and what we have is that Julio Rodriguez refused to be hidden in plain sight. Now here's a vignette, a story about Francisco Lindor. During the September 2020 panel on colorism in baseball, Lindor shared an interaction that happened while he was playing with Cleveland. Lindor mentioned that he was speaking pregame on the field with another Latino player, a younger Latino player. And Lindor was speaking to him in Spanish. While they're having their conversation, another white American teammate came by and told Lindor, stop, speak in English. Lindor was very upset by this incident, so much so that, well, afterwards he was sharing it as we in academia use as the term a microaggression that was happening to him on the baseball field. Lindor wondered, what was it that would inspire a teammate to tell him and another Latino teammate not to speak in Spanish on the field? The important thing for me is that this is not an isolated incident. These kinds of stories about Latinos in Major League Baseball go back to the days before Roberto Clemente, to the early days of integration. In fact, it goes back to the days before baseball's color line was dismantled, to the 19-teens and 20s, when the first wave of Cuban players and other Latinos began to enter into the major leagues. This talk provides a sketch of the challenges that Afro-Latinos have encountered in getting their stories, experience, and history in baseball seen and told and understood. Multiple factors have resulted in Afro-Latinos becoming hidden in plain sight. So I'm going to share with you another one. September 1st, 1971. This game was the first time a major league team had an all-black lineup. The Pittsburgh Pirates fielded this lineup as you see on the screen. top to bottom, every single one of those players was Black. This game has been written about by journalists now for decades, celebrating it as a moment of a big moment in African-American history, baseball history. And yet, I want you to take a closer look at this lineup. Here's another view of that same lineup alongside one of the two columns here in this slide. Randy Stinnett, Roberto Clemente, Manny Sanguillen, Jackie Hernandez, 4 of the 9 starting players for the Pittsburgh Pirates were not just Black, but also Latino. And in how this game has been written about, oftentimes the story of the 4 Afro-Latinos has been not fully emphasized, stressed, highlighted, but it has been told as a story of Black players, and by some, actually told as a story of African-American players. So let's look to the other column here, counting races, invisible Latinos. So in 1947, on April 15th, Jackie Robinson made his debut at the Brooklyn Dodgers and became the first Black player to play in the major leagues since 1889. He was later joined by Larry Doby, Hank Thompson, and Willard Brown, all former Negro Leaguers, in playing in the 1947 season. That began a process where every major league team would begin to incorporate Black talent. In fact, 4 of the 16 major league teams, that's 4 out of 16, would actually have an Afro-Latino be that first player to integrate the team. Now, let's look at these other statistics for now. African Americans in baseball. One of the well-cited but miscited numbers in the history of Blacks in baseball has been told as African Americans in Major League Baseball in 1975, that it was the high point of African American participation in baseball. The number that was cited was 28%. Now, the issue becomes, who exactly is counted in that 28%? And as it was later found through the research of a couple of baseball scholars, those numbers actually hid Latinos in plain sight. Before I go into those numbers, let me share what culminates the 1971 season. Just over a month after the Pirates had that all-Black lineup, in October, the Pittsburgh Pirates defeat the heavily favored Baltimore Orioles in the 1971 World Series. And in the clubhouse where the Pirates are celebrating, we have a different kind of historical moment, a cultural moment, one that for many Latinos across the United States and the Caribbean and into Latin America remember quite fondly. Here's an image of Bob Prince, usually the Pittsburgh Pirates announcer, but in this photo, he's actually working for NBC television, broadcasting the game of the World Series. He's interviewing Roberto Clemente. And as Bob Prince begins to talk to him, Roberto asks, before I answer your questions, I beg apologies, but I'd like to address my family in Puerto Rico. And he begins to talk in Spanish. And he asks for la bendición, the blessing. He asks of his parents to give him, on this greatest day of his baseball life, their blessing, and extend his blessing, la bendición, to his children, who were also in Puerto Rico. Interestingly enough, these were the first words in Spanish broadcast live via satellite on a US TV network. So it's interesting how in this moment, Roberto Clemente refused to be silent, refused to be invisible, but actually flipped the script to be very visible in showing all aspects of who he is as a proud Black Puerto Rican player. let's go to the demographics now. Because as I shared before, that 28% number was erroneous. Mark Armour and Dan Levitt, two baseball historians, undertook a rather lengthy study of baseball demographics that this slide shows. Basically, they went back through press guides and other materials, and they literally counted up from the rosters and such the number of white Americans, of Latinos, of African Americans, and of Asians in baseball. And they presented new data. And let me share why these data matter. So if you're looking on screen, the highest, the purple, on my screen at least it's purple, is for white Americans. For our purposes, that red line is most significant. It is the percentage of Latino players in Major League Baseball. And you'll notice that right around 1993, Latinos eclipsed African American participation. You'll also notice that the high point of African American participation is about 20%, not 28%. Some of the notable stats here are 1967, Latinos eclipsed the 10% margin of Major League Baseball. If you notice in this image, you can also see that the majority, and this is actually from the 1965 All-Star game, the majority of players, Latino players in this image are Afro-Latinos. In 1993, Latinos surpassed African Americans as a percentage of Major League Baseball players. And ever since, that percentage has gone larger and larger in terms of this greater representation of players from Latin America and US Latinos compared to the percentage of African Americans in Major League Baseball. There's a history to that. We can talk about that in the Q&A, but I want to focus on the Afro-Latino stories for the presentation. Now, Latinos had played on both sides of the color line. From 1902 to 1947, we had 53 Latinos that appeared in Major League Baseball. During that same time, you had over 240 Latinos that played in the Negro Leagues and leagues that preceded it, which we all now call Negro Leagues. It is there where we see the start of players like Manny Minoso, just like Jackie Robinson. They started in the Negro Leagues. It was important to note, because even I didn't know this, a lifelong baseball fan, multi-generational within the family of being baseball fans, how the overwhelming majority of Latinos who started playing professionally in the United States during the time a color line prevented Blacks from playing in the major leagues. They had played, that is, Latinos played in the Negro Leagues. It's also important to note that the Negro Leagues did not exclude on the basis of color. That is, Latino players from the lightest to the darkest could find a place to play in the Negro Leagues. The same was not true for the players seeking to play in the major leagues. That is, Latino players who sought to play in the major leagues. See, I knew about those early Latinos, and many Latinos, in this case, Puerto Ricans in particular, know about Iran Bithorn, who in Chicago for the Cubs was known as High Bithorn, right-handed pitcher, who on April 15, 1942, 5 years before Jackie Robinson broke the color line, appeared, Bithorn that is, with the Cubs, made his major league debut. The following year, 1943, Luis Rodriguez Olmo, who was nicknamed El Jíbaro, basically country folk in Puerto Rico, that Olmo played with the Brooklyn Dodgers, again, before Jackie Robinson. The important thing here was, and I'll talk about this in just a few, that how did those Latinos get into the major leagues? The other part of the story is that the overwhelming majority of Latino players were playing in the Negro leagues. It's interesting to me how these Latino players, even Afro-Latino players, become hidden in plain sight. It's even personal in my family story. In 2006, after my manuscript was off, my first book, Playing America's Game, was off at the publisher, I went down to Georgia to visit family. One of my uncles came up from St. Petersburg, Florida, drove up, and we gathered at my parents' home. And we talked, and I asked him, we called him Toño. Toño, did you know that there was a player in the Negro Leagues who had the name Jose Antonio Burgos? And my uncle smiled and looked at me and said, yes. Did you know your grandmother, his mother, named me after her? I had no idea. And so even there, through a personal story, a personal anecdote, we can see that for a lot of these Latino players, they were even hidden in our own familiar stories, family stories. Now, one of the interesting things to me is how when Latinos were breaking into the league, they weren't as hidden as they become later. Robert Boyle, who wrote for Sports Illustrated a number of articles in the 1960s about baseball, he covered many sports for Sports Illustrated, but he was San Francisco based and he covered the Giants and he wrote stories about Latinos breaking in, but also of African Americans. He wrote this really important article that was The Private World of what he called the Negro Ball Player. It was published in 1960. In that article, Boyle interviewed not just African American players, but also Afro-Latinos, Black Latinos, who were part of the generation who followed Jackie Robinson, who integrated baseball. You can see in the images at the bottom a number of individuals. One of them is Alex Pompez, who worked as a scout and eventually the director of international scouting for San Francisco Giants. Next to him, Chicago fans, Sox fans, Southsiders, you have Minnie Minoso. You also have Felix Mantilla, who unfortunately passed away just 2 months ago. Mantilla, along with Hank Aaron, were roommates in the South Atlantic League when they integrated that league together. 2 Black men, one African American from Alabama, the other one Afro-Puerto Rican. Together, they faced the hostilities of the opposing players, sometimes even their own teammates, who did not support the breaking of the color line. And so even though Jackie had broken the color line and had begun the process of integrating baseball, those things still was a process that one had to go through in the minor leagues and in other major league teams. Minnie Minoso himself illuminates how the path of an Afro-Latino was complex in terms of understanding his racial experience. And here you have 2 quotes. The one on top comes out as he was explaining how into a clubhouse skirmish with Harry Simpson, a teammate with the Cleveland team. And here Minoso writes in one of his autobiographies, he has like 4. And so Minoso writes, when I came to the United States, I was surprised and a bit amused to hear some Black ball players tell me I didn't understand prejudice and discrimination because I was Cuban, not Black. When it came to the experience of other Afro-Latinos, here we have Orlando Cepeda talking about what it felt like playing and living in the United States as a professional ball player. And he talks about how they had 2 strikes against them, one for being Black and another for being Latino. Speaking with Roger Kahn, Roberto Clemente put it even more bluntly in speaking to what it was to be a Black Latino in the United States. You see, the experience that I'm trying to get at in this project is about being Black and brown, if you want to use those colloquial terms for race, or color terms, but also to get at the dynamic where for Afro-Latinos, the story of cultural adjustment is not just moving from a Spanish-speaking society to an English-speaking society, but it's also in being Black in the United States, on top of being Black in the country of origin, and at how those racial systems were not exactly the same. So for Minoso, as he was helping to integrate Major League Baseball, he was the first Black Latino in the major leagues. He at times received questions, to put it gently, other times hostility, even from African Americans like Harry Suitcase Simpson, who questioned his Blackness because he came from a different culture. He came from a different society. Unfortunately, that issue would persist for Afro-Latinos. Whereas Orlando Cepeda talked about it in terms of having 2 strikes against him, for our purposes tonight, I want to talk about double invisibility. Not being seen, well, and there's a saying among Latino cultures, too Black to be viewed as Latino, too Latino to be viewed as Black. So here in 2011, on the occasion of Major League Baseball celebrating Jackie Robinson Day, Torrey Hunter, then an outfielder with the California Angels, or it might have been the Los Angeles Angels of Anaheim at that point, shared a couple of poignant comments. Poignant because Hunter wanted to really highlight the decline of African American participation in baseball. But with these 2 quotes, and these are not the only quotes that Hunter gave to USA Today, but the most useful for our purposes here. He's told the reporter for USA Today, people see darker faces out there and the perception is that they're African American. They're not us. They're imposters. Even people I know come up and say, hey, what color is Vladimir Guerrero? Is he a Black player? And Hunter would reply to them, come on, he's Dominican. He's not Black. And so here we see how the status of an Afro-Latino, the Blackness of an Afro-Latino is being called into question. Torrey Hunter is not alone. There is a longer history, and in fact, a very complex history about how the racial status of Afro-Latinos was manipulated when it came to the time of baseball's color line. You see, during the 1940s, when players were playing with the Washington Senators, in particular, the Washington Senators were the most active Major League Baseball team in Latin America. But they also signed a number of what I refer to as racially ambiguous ball players. And they would tell the baseball public, when they were questioned, why is Roberto Estrella allowed to play in the major leagues? He's darker than Roy Campanella, an African-American from Philly, who's being excluded. And the response was, he's not Black, he's Cuban. That was the response of Clark Griffith and other team officials with the Washington Senators. What this shows us is the power that major league team officials had to create categories in baseball for Afro-Latinos. But the other interesting part about this is how they presented these players to the baseball public not as Black, but as Cuban. This is an important part of the story of baseball's color line, of Major League Baseball's color line, because it was white team owners, team officials, league officials who had the power to invite players into the league, players who are not previously included. It also shows us another important lesson. And that lesson is that it is the power or the purpose of Major League Baseball's color line was not to exclude all players of color, but rather was to exclude Black players. That was the ultimate purpose of baseball's color line. And the justification for the inclusion of players who, in Cuba, folks knew that Roberto Estrella had African ancestry. But the explanation in US baseball circles was given that he's not Black, he's Cuban, as if one could not be both Black and Cuban. So Torii Hunter, as I said before, is not alone. This has long been a way in which the Blackness of Latinos is rendered invisible or deployed in such a fashion for individuals to take advantage of the talent of that player and yet continue Black exclusion. There's a flip side to this story. And that is, while we had in the 1970s a figure, a presence like Roberto Clemente, a proud Black man, a proud Puerto Rican, viewers of the show Saturday Night Live in 1979 were introduced to the fictional Dominican ball player, Chico Escuela. Chico was the first to use the line that you would hear Sammy Sosa, even Minnie Minoso say, "Baseball has been very, very good to me." Now, here's the thing with Chico Escuela. He was a spoof character. He presented a different version of Afro-Latino masculinity, of Afro-Latino identity, one in which they were being presented for comedic fodder, for laughs. And it was a way in which the presence and participation of actual Afro-Latinos was being hidden behind this facade or this new presentation of an image of players who are, and this is what was supposedly humorous about Escuela, inability to communicate in proper English. That is, he constantly spoke malapropisms and couldn't understand. And when push came to shove, he would just answer, "Baseball has been very, very good to me." So Escuela is a very vexing character for me. And I would say in the history of how we think about baseball and Afro-Latinos. Even today, we see representations of Afro-Latinos. And here you have, again, several ball players from Yasiel Puig, the flashy Yasiel Puig, the temperamental Yasiel Puig. Carlos Martinez, we've heard both those, temperamental, flashy. And Jose Abreu, who actually presents for many people the quiet Latino player that many people can embrace, but also someone who has or relies on translators instead of being able to learn English in such a fashion that would talk with sports writers, journalists in English. We've also had our own generation's Chico Escuela. In David Ortiz, at least the character of David Ortiz as played by Kenan Thompson. And there are plenty. If you go on YouTube, you can find a number of times from 2014 to 2020 when Kenan Thompson portrays David Ortiz, Big Boppy. So I'm not going to play any clips. You can find them. Here's what's useful for me. That Ortiz language, his big appetite, his humorous personality, his flashiness, all are once again part of the presentation of Afro-Latinos for the consumption of a US audience. For me, what is really interesting on the flip side of that is how Pedro Martinez, David Ortiz, and many other Afro-Latinos have to deal with the media. And here's a quote from, I'll just use one of them, from Pedro Martinez. "We may be Latin, but we're not dumb. We see everything." Let me jump ahead. Because here we have Big Papi himself talking about the mental process he goes through in trying to answer a question during an English language interview. He talks about how he hears the question in English, he translates it in his head to Spanish, then he thinks of an answer in Spanish, translates it into English, and then begins to offer his response. Now, for some journalists, that whole process takes too long, or it makes them look slow. For players like Ortiz, Pedro Martinez, who are stars, even they at times become timid about their interactions with the English language press because they don't want to be misrepresented. They don't want to be made fun of for their ability to communicate in English what they were going through. So the mockery, making fun of Latino players and their accent, has continued to be practiced even as the presentation, or the representation of Latinos has grown in Major League Baseball. Some closing thoughts. And this is what inspired me to revisit this history. Last year, during 2020 baseball season, the Black Lives Matter movement began to have an impact on the playing of games in Major League Baseball. Baseball historian here, I was surprised that Major League Baseball actually had games canceled or postponed for allowing players, or so that they would allow players to engage in active protests about the killings of African Americans and Black people in the United States, about their experience. Now, here's a couple of caveats that's worth noting about why listening, engaging Afro-Latinos matter in baseball. Since the 2000s, the majority of Black players in Major League Baseball have been Afro-Latinos and not African American. And I'm not saying that, of course, we should not engage African American ball players. Dominic Smith, David Price, Mookie Betts, and many other African Americans shared their thoughts, their experience, and importantly, gave voice to the experience of Black men in the United States, to Black community in the United States. But I want to add that, again, we need to engage the experience of Afro-Latinos like a Francisco Lindor. What does it mean in baseball to have a reckoning with its racial past for not understanding the difficulties of being a Black Latino in baseball? Not just that. How do we understand the different experience of African Americans and Afro-Latinos and how they're actually shared in the basis of the story of the Negro Leagues, but actually begin to segue or separate into two different veins when it comes to Major League Baseball? The question I had asked a sports writer I know was, why is it that they didn't ask Afro-Latino players like Lindor about their experience in the United States? Although he was born in Caguas, Puerto Rico, Francisco Lindor came to the United States, as I believe he was just 13, goes to high school in Florida, and experiences what it is to be a Black teenager, male teenager, in Florida during a period where we'll see Trayvon Martin killed. What does it mean to be Black and brown during this time about immigration crises? And much like what happened to Minnie Minoso, to Vladimir Guerrero, why is it that the voices of Afro-Latinos not made visible, but rather are hidden in plain sight? Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burgos, and absolutely fascinating talk and presentation. And I'm sure we could obviously go on for hours about this. We've received a bunch of great questions already. I would encourage folks that are joining us today to go ahead and continue to submit those as we go along here. We'll try to get to as many as possible before the end of our hour here. I'll start with a fairly large question. What is Major League Baseball doing to attempt to have a more positive impact on this issue?
So I will say it's really interesting because there are different parts of Major League Baseball. And so there's the institution, the league, the corporation. The panel, I participated in this panel that it was a resource group within Major League Baseball dealing with Latino issues. And that was the speaking at that colorism panel. So Major League Baseball are those within Major League Baseball that are trying to educate others about the experience of Afro-Latinos, of Latinos as a whole. The other part of this is the team part of that story. And this is where a number of people on radio and sports media, online and social media, were criticizing Kevin Mather for his forthrightness, perhaps, in talking about Julio Rodriguez, that is. And in particular, saying what they would say is he said the quiet part out loud. He, as a member, you see, the front offices of major league teams is perhaps still the space that needs to have greater diversity of voices involved. And yes, we saw Kim Yang being hired by the Florida, I guess it's Miami Marlins now. I grew up with them in South Florida. It's the Florida Marlins, so I always have to slip back, Miami Marlins. And so she's the first woman to be a general manager of a Major League Baseball team. She's also an Asian American woman. So she's breaking barriers. And what's interesting is that there are other barriers to be broken. And the fact that Kevin Mather was a baseball lifer. He kind of rose through the Seattle Mariners ranks to become president and CEO. And he also had these views of Latinos, of Afro-Latinos, about their personality. And for me, it shows that while the league may do certain efforts, or those within the leagues may take on certain efforts, it's also very much a 30-team issue that each of those teams have to address within their institutional culture, within their personnel, both front office and field. So there have been efforts. And the translator, this is a long answer, but this is the last part of the answer. So that translator that the Kevin Mather complained about, that was actually the result of Carlos Beltran, former Major League player, manager of the New York Mets for less than a minute. Carlos Beltran had advocated that the Latino players Major League players should have translators provided so that they could communicate more easily with the press, the English language press. This was about communication and how to have the best presentation of the ball players. He had been advocating that for years. I mean, Latinos have been advocating for that. It goes back to Ozzie Guillen when he was a ball player saying, we need translators provided. And it's not that players want to hide, they want to present their best image to the public and communicate most clearly with the press.
So Dr. Burgos, you spoke about the executives in the front office a bit. We had a question from Daniel Summons along those same lines. He says, it seems that Latinos and other minorities are very much being kept from managers and executive roles, really with the rise of analytics. Obviously, the NFL has done some things with the Rooney Rule, trying to encourage minority hiring, and certainly, I think they're obviously evaluating that as the years go. But what are some other things you think baseball should do to overcome that bias? And he says, other than having everyone throw their laptops in the nearest body of water.
Well, again, thanks for the question. And there is this interesting dynamic at play here, because you have among Latinos who have not yet been hired as managers, a group of ball players who are actually US educated. Someone like Eduardo Perez, who was at various moments a candidate for a major league position the last 2 years, who is a graduate of Florida State. You have Raul Ibanez, who also has a college degree, and you have, if I remember correctly, Joey Cora went to Vanderbilt. So you have a group of players who have been managerial prospects but are never hired, have not yet to be hired as managers. And so this question about analytics is interesting to me because I've spoken with Eduardo Perez. I know he understands analytics, and he's also a great communicator. He's also bilingual. He's also a baseball lifer, multi-generational. His father was Antenacio, Tony Perez, Hall of Famer. So Eduardo Perez has a baseball pedigree that rivals just about any individual, and yet has not been hired. Baseball had the C-League rule that had required for minority candidates to also be. The issue is about enforcement and whether these interviews are being done broadly, intentionally, in terms of really giving these ball players or these candidates a shot. I mean, you do have a couple of major league managers that are Latino. You have Charlie Montoyo in Toronto, Davey Martinez, a New York born and raised Puerto Rican. And so but we did lose Rick Renteria, who was the manager of the Chicago White Sox, who was hired, who's agreed to part ways in baseball parlance with the White Sox, and then was replaced by Tony La Russa. And so, the process of how do Latinos get the opportunity to be managers, general managers, is one that it's not just Latinos, but also African Americans. And, is that analytics revolution, or is it the network problem? That they're not in the network with that young generation of general managers who were Dartmouth, Yale, Ivy League educated. You do see in San Francisco where they have their general manager is someone who is not white. He's actually of Middle Eastern descent. And so, again, there are barriers that are being broken. But the culture of baseball has not been broken. That's where we don't see the diversity truly transforming the game.
So, Dr. Burgos, we have a question from Paul Lubinsky, and Paul, great to see you on the line tonight. For Afro-Latino players who have played in Canada, so thinking about the Blue Jays, formerly the Expos, and minor league affiliates, has their experience been similar or different from those that have played in the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, the Montreal Expos were a unique ball club. I mean, there's a history of integration in Montreal that goes back to Jackie playing the 1946 season there, Jackie Robinson. Roberto Clemente playing a season there before he was pirated away by Pittsburgh from the Brooklyn Dodgers organization. But also that Felipe Alou, Dominican-born manager, who was also a longtime major leaguer, was the manager of the Expos before he later joined the San Francisco Giants. There was a culture to both the city, or there is a culture to the city of Montreal, but also to the Montreal Expos because of who their manager was. And that is why ball players like Pedro Martinez, who was cast off by the Los Angeles Dodgers in a trade to Montreal, flourishes under Felipe Alou. Alou was bilingual, but also then picks up some French while he was there in Montreal. He was a great communicator. He recounts a number of his experiences in traversing what it meant to be Black in the United States in his own autobiography that was published about 3 years ago called Alou, My Baseball Journeys. And so I think Montreal, because there was a culture to the city and to the team that invited diversity, embraced it, celebrated it. That gets lost when the team shifts to Washington and gets reborn as the Washington Nationals.
So you mentioned at one point, if we're remembering correctly, that Jackie Robinson was the first Black player in Major League Baseball since 1889. Was there a player before him, and who was that? And is there a story to go along with that?
And I think that was Gary Gillette who asked that question. Hi, Gary, trying to get me. So we had Moses Fleetwood Walker playing in American Association and went back to Toledo Ball Club of the American Association and bounced around the minor leagues and bounced back up to the majors. Trying to remember who it was in 1889. Off the top of my head, Gary, I can't remember. I'm sorry for that. What we know is that by the end of the 1880s, African-American players were being purged, not just from Major League Baseball, but from many of the elite minor leagues. We saw quite a few of them in 1887 playing in the International League, and players like Bud Fowler, Frank Grant, and others, but they too become pushed out of the league as it embraced, as the International League embraced segregation.
Great. So Brian O'Connor, fairly specific question here. He said he has a 1952 baseball registry, which lists all the players in the majors, and for each there's a line of ancestry. So things like Dutch, German, American Negro, Venezuelan. But for Roy Campanella, that line doesn't appear. Do you feel like that is intentional, interesting? Any other examples of that?
Yeah, well, that's interesting that would happen, because Campanella, for sure, his mother was an African-American woman and his father, Campanella, was actually Italian-American. And so he was the son of an interracial couple. And for the purposes of the United States and its professional leagues, he was Black. And therefore, he was excluded from playing. So I don't know why the 1952 baseball register would not specify. But also, here comes my historian cap, remember that in much of the United States, there were laws against interracial marriage, miscegenation. And that doesn't really get eliminated until the Loving versus Virginia decision, where miscegenation laws were struck down by the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court.
So we had someone write in and ask the question, why do you think participation by African Americans in baseball has declined, yet Afro-Latinos seem to continue to participate at the same or higher levels?
Yeah, and this is both a historical and a contemporary question. The contemporary issue is that in the United States, elite high school baseball or 14 to 18-year-old baseball is pay to play. That players, families have to spend exorbitant amounts of money to participate in travel baseball and travel tournaments. They pay for being scouted by the prestigious scouting companies to have their data put online for baseball coaches, recruiters to look at, scouts to look at. In the Dominican Republic, it's not a pay-to-play system. I've been participating with the Smithsonian on a project called Play Ball in the barrios and in the big leagues. And we had done an interview with this Dominican person who shared something that in the United States doesn't make sense. And this is what that individual said. Baseball is a poor person's sport. All you need is a stick and a ball, and you can play. That is the Dominican mindset. You can play anywhere, anytime. A ball and a stick, and let's go play baseball. In the United States, that's not the model. You need the glove, you need the bat, you need to be on the right travel team. It's very expensive in the United States. There are other opportunities to play organized sports in the United States that are either subsidized, think football. The phenomenon of travel football is not the same as travel baseball. There's high school football, which operates at a level that's way bigger than high school baseball. And high school football subsidized by the public, or by, if it's for a private school, by the donors and the money's coming out of the institution. Baseball doesn't operate that way in the United States. So that's the current answer. The historical answer is one where Major League Baseball did not invest in the Black baseball talent pipeline. It actually dismantled it by ensuring that the Negro Leagues would not be incorporated into organized baseball, into the affiliated minor leagues, but rather the talented Willie Mays, Hank Aaron, and on, would be signed for $10,000, $15,000, where their value, had they been white, would have been $150,000, $200,000. And what this was followed up by the disinvestment in Black baseball throughout the United States, to such an extent that in many communities, the path to a professional, not even professional, to a college opportunity was through basketball, through football, not baseball.
So Kyron or Kieran, I apologize if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, said that they appreciate all the White Sox love. Minoso and Abreu shout outs, that's great. They were curious about one more White Sox Afro-Latino, Luis Robert, and what is the official pronunciation of his last name? And what do you think are the origins of his surname, Robert? And I'm sure I'm getting this wrong as well, as a Cuban player.
Luis Robert, yes. It is a powerful story of the African diaspora throughout Latin America, throughout the Caribbean. I often ask students in my Constructing Race in America class, as well as in my Caribbean Latino migrations course, what is the most spoken language of people, of Black people in the Americas? And a few of them always raise their hand, English. It's like, nope, they're not even second. Brazilian Portuguese, Spanish, and then it's close between French and English. And part of that is because of the impact of the enslavement of African people who were transported across the Atlantic and brought to places like Havana, San Juan, and other ports throughout Latin America. And then even after the period of slavery, in the emancipation moments, or throughout even the period of enslavement, you had African peoples who were emancipating themselves, running away. And I'll share with you a story of a professor who I studied under, whose last name is Kelly. But his mother was born in Panama. His grandfathers were born in Cuba, and his great-grandparents were born in Jamaica. What are they? Well, one, they're part of the African diaspora, but two, nationality can at times really not tell the full story of the circulation of African peoples within the Americas. And so where exactly the last name Robert comes from, I don't fully know the personal history. I haven't gotten an opportunity of interviewing Luis Robert, but it does signal to us that history of the African diaspora. And I saw someone mention about Eloy Jimenez. And here you, in the case of Eloy, you have an Afro-Venezuelan. And often folks, don't quite realize that, yes, the African diaspora was also in Venezuela, in Colombia, it's throughout Latin America.
Great. So I know we're close to time here. We have so many wonderful questions. I want to ask one final question to really bring it home here to Champaign-Urbana. We had Warren write in and ask, does the University of Illinois have any Afro-Latino baseball players on its team? And should they be recruiting these players? And maybe just talk a little bit about college baseball in general, and if Afro-Latinos are coming up through college baseball at all.
I don't know if there's an Afro-Latino. I know there's a couple of Latino players with the Illini baseball team this current year. I actually taught one of them in my Constructing Race in America course last semester. So this year, he's one of the more recent arrivals to the team. But as to Afro-Latinos, there aren't too many in college baseball as a whole. If they're coming from Latin America, there have been a couple of programs, pipelines that were created. And in the 1990s, you saw a number of players who went, and now I'm trying, Plácido Polanco is part of this pipeline of Dominican players who were educated in different institutions, educational institutions of higher ed in Florida, and then went from there to being drafted. Typically, Major League Baseball itself is more committed to bringing players at the age of 16 into its minor league system, which means that late bloomers may not even be recruited by major league teams. That is an 18-year-old. And oftentimes there's this prejudice. Now I'm trying, Jose Bautista is the rare instance where you have a college-educated Dominican who went from playing college baseball in the United States to ultimately playing in the major leagues for well over 10 years. But those cases about Dominicans and Venezuelans, they're typically coming out of the baseball academies in Dominican Republic. High school baseball in Dominican Republic is not that big of a thing because most of the talent has been siphoned off into the US system already. So the opportunity for those players to actually get noticed and scouted to play college baseball is very minimal.
Well, Dr. Burgos, I know we could literally go for another 2 hours with all of the great questions, but unfortunately our time is coming to an end here. So I just want to say thank you again so much for joining us. It's been an absolutely wonderful hour, and I want to thank everyone who attended this evening as well. Just a few closing thoughts. I would again encourage everyone to visit the Alumni Association website. We do have a great speaker series that you are part of this evening. We've got a lot of other great faculty, staff, and university leadership coming up. You'll see on your screen now. We have our next iteration is April 15th, and it's an anti-racism workshop. So this is more in the professional personal development category of our speaker series. I think it's obviously fitting coming off of this evening as well. So encourage you to join that, and would also encourage you to check out Alumni Link, which is one of our newest initiatives and something that we're very passionate about. It's a platform for alumni to connect with students and fellow alumni, to do networking, to do mentorship, participate in discussion boards, and to see a lot of great resources that are available on Alumni Link. You can also check out a recording of Dr. Burgos's talk and our other faculty and university leaders on there as well. So again, thank you so much for joining this evening. We look forward to seeing you at an event in the near future. Hope you have a great evening, and thank you again.